let's jump into how to ask good questions at the end of your interview. Now, I'm going to give you a bunch of questions to ask. So let's talk about some things you can ask about the company. First of all, before you go on the interview, do some research about the company. Look for any news or recent events about the company. And you could ask about any recent, like for example, let's say that they recently acquired another company. So the interviewer says, do you have any questions for me? Yes, I do have a few questions. First, I was doing some research. I see you guys acquired company XYZ 3 months ago. How's that going? Or how do you think that will impact the company overall or the strategy? So, and another thing you could ask, whether there was an acquisition or a recent event, you could just ask about the strategy short and long term as, what are your thoughts? What knowledge do you have about the short and long term strategy for the company? Yeah, that's a very good question to ask. If you're going to choose them over going to work for somewhere else, not only do you want the employer to know that you're the best person for them, but you should be trying to figure out, are they the best employer for you? Show them that, hey, you're not sure about me. I'm also not sure about you. I'm committed long-term if I decide to work with you. But before I decide that, I want to know more about you. This is showing a curiosity, a level of preparation, a level of sophistication. So ask about the strategy. You could ask how the company compares to the competition. If they compete against company ABC, if I could ask you, I know that ABC is your direct competitor. How do you compare against them? What is your competitive advantage? Then, from a financial standpoint, you might want to ask about the ownership structure for the company. Depending on the type of company you're interviewing with, most likely there's some sort of ownership, whether they're a publicly traded company, whether they're owned by private equity, owner operated. You could ask about the ownership, and that could lead to questions about, do you know if there's a plan to go public? Do you know if there's a plan to go private? So while those are not real critical questions for them to hire you, it really will make a good improvement. By the way, keep in mind, you probably have at most about 10 to 15 minutes to ask questions. So you don't need to ask 30 different questions in each of these categories. You're looking for maybe 2 or 3 would be more than enough. So after you've asked some company questions, you can drill down to the department level. And then this is where you could ask some questions about how the organization is structured. How does this organization fit with other departments? How does this team fit with other departments in the organization? What other departments do you work closely with? You might want to start to ask about the hiring manager. How do you fit in the organization? How would you describe your management style? That's a fair question to ask. You're not basically saying, hey, are you a difficult person? Do people like working for you? You're just saying, hey, what's your style? How do you work with people? It's a very good question to ask, even knowing it might seem a little intimidating or maybe delicate. After you've asked some department questions, then you drill down to talk about the individual position. Obviously at this point in the interview, maybe they've talked a lot about the position that you would be hired for, but maybe they've missed some details. So this is where you can ask some details. Maybe they haven't clearly discussed the objectives. So what are the objectives of this position? How will you measure success for this individual? What is the opportunity for growth in this position? That's a great question. That shows that you're ambitious, that, what am I going to learn here in this position? What could I do if I'm successful in this role? What can be next? Who else will I be working with in this role? And then you could kind of ask them, a question they might have for you is, why should we hire you? A great question that you could ask them is, why should someone choose this position over other sales positions at similar type companies? Get them to sell you on the company, on the position. All right. So if you go through any of those stages and sets of questions, asking 2 or 3 at each level, trust me, you will make a good impression, and likely your competition is not going to go through any type of process like that. The next step, after you've asked your questions, that's usually the end of the interview. Although it's not the end of the interview, because remember, this is not an interview, this is a sales call, and the next step is closing the sale. Now, I'm going to provide some very clear questions and steps you can go through to close the hiring manager at the end of the interview. So we can go through some other categories of questions here. The first category question is trial close questions. Trial close questions are good to ask as a salesperson. If you're showing a product, you might want to a prospect, you might want to ask, what do you think? think? Is this something you would use? Is this something you were hoping to see? Is it doing what you hoped it would do? Where do we stand? How does everything look? So trial close questions for the hiring manager might be, what do you think of this interview so far? How do you think I compare against the requirements of the position? Is there any reason why you think I am not the right candidate? How do I compare against other candidates that you are considering? If you had to make a decision today, which way would you lean? Great questions, not only to kind of see where you stand so you don't go home and think you have the position, but these are questions that are really going to make a good impression on you as a salesperson as you're interviewing for a sales job. Then we can progress to ask some hard close questions. So what's the next step in the process? Now, of course, you could assume that the next step is that they hire someone or pick someone, but maybe it's not. Maybe they have internal steps that you have to interview with someone else, or there's a screening or whatever. Ask them, what's the next step in the process? That's a great sales question when you're talking to a prospect also. So it's a good question to make a good impression here. Is there anything that will prevent us from moving forward to that next step? What would you like to do next? When can I expect to hear back from you? What is the best way and time for me to follow up with you? So really good hard close questions there. Maybe there are other questions you could add, but that should get you going in the right direction. All right, so that's pretty much it for today. Hopefully there's been a few tips in here that you can take with you, and we would be very happy if any of these tips helped you to land a sales job that you're looking for. If you want to return the favor of any of those tips, very easy for you to do. Simply like, comment, share this video, subscribe to our channel. All or any of those help us tremendously, and none of those cost you anything. If you kind of like the way we kind of organize things here and the things we talk about, you may want to follow us on any of these social platforms. We post videos every morning in 30 to 60 second increments with a daily sales tip. So be sure to follow us here. And if you want any more information on SalesScripter or any other tips on selling, you can go to salescripter.com. You can contact us. There's a chat window. There's also tons of resources in terms of videos, ebooks, all sorts of stuff on salescripter.com. So thanks for being here. Hope this was helpful. We'll see you on the next training video. Take care. Have a great day.